Imagine a world where the snows of Moscow are stained black with ash. It is December 1941, but the miracle never comes. The Siberian divisions, the desperate reinforcements that historically saved Stalin, are nowhere to be seen. Instead, the Wehrmacht smashes through the gates of the Kremlin unchallenged. Now look east. Imagine the rising sun flag fluttering not over the burning battleships of Pearl Harbor, but over the frozen, occupied harbor of Vladivostok. Japanese Type 97 tanks are not navigating the humid jungles of Malaya. They're churning through the brutal Siberian tundra, closing the gap to meet German panzers in a handshake that spans the globe. In this world, the American fleet sits safe and silent in Hawaii. There is no day of infamy. There is only a terrified silence as the United States watches from across the ocean, untouched but completely alone. The Soviet Union has been erased. The Axis powers have united across the roof of the world. This is not science fiction. This is the terrifying reality of the Northern Strategy, the plan that was one decision away from ending the war before it truly began.
To understand how close the world came to this nightmare, we must step back from the brink and enter the sweaty, smoke-filled war rooms of Tokyo in the summer of 1941. We often view the Second World War as a scripted inevitability. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, America enters the war, the Allies win. But in 1941, nothing was scripted. The Empire of Japan was paralyzed by a vicious internal fracture, a strategic schizophrenia that split the military command right down the middle. There were two roads ahead, and they pointed in opposite directions. On one side stood the Imperial Japanese Navy, backed by industrial technocrats. Their doctrine was Handshake, the Southern Expansion Doctrine. They looked at the map and saw the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines. They saw rubber, tin, and most importantly, oil. But this road had a massive obstacle: the United States Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. To go south meant war with the industrial giant of America. On the other side stood the Imperial Japanese Army, the dominant political force in the country. Their doctrine was Hokushin-ron, the Northern Expansion Doctrine. They didn't care about the tropical islands. They were obsessed with their old ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. For decades, the army had prepared for a decisive war on the plains of Manchuria. They wanted to strike north, seize the resource-rich Primoria region, and shatter the Soviet presence in the Far East. This wasn't just a debate, it was a feud. The Army and Navy hated each other almost as much as they hated the Allies. And for a long time, the northern road seemed impossible. Why? Because of a ghost that haunted the Japanese army, Nomonhan. In 1939, at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, or Nomonhan, the Japanese army had tested the Soviets and lost badly. Georgy Zhukov, the future savior of Moscow, had crushed a Japanese force with superior tanks and artillery. That defeat sent a shockwave through Tokyo. It humiliated the Strike North faction and convinced many that the Red Army was invincible. The army licked its wounds, signed a neutrality pact with Stalin in April 1941, and turned their eyes south. But history rarely moves in a straight line. Just 2 months later, on June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler shattered the world order. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers stormed into the Soviet Union. The Red Army, the force that had terrified Japan in 1939, was suddenly collapsing. Entire Soviet armies were being encircled and annihilated in weeks. The invincible Russian bear was bleeding out on the European floor. In Tokyo, the Strike North faction suddenly woke up. The strategic calculus had flipped overnight.
Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, a fervent supporter of the Axis alliance, rushed to the imperial palace. He didn't care about the neutrality pact he had just signed. He famously told the emperor, "We must attack Russia. We must join our German allies and strike the communist beast while it is distracted." The analogy used in the high command was that of a ripe persimmon. The Soviet Union was the fruit, hanging heavy and ready to fall. Japan just had to shake the tree. The Army General Staff began quietly dusting off plans for an invasion. They called it the Kantokukuen, the special maneuvers of the Kwantung Army. This wasn't a theoretical exercise. It was a massive mobilization plan involving over 700,000 men, thousands of horses, and hundreds of aircraft, all gathering on the Manchurian border, waiting for the order to cross the Amur River. The window of opportunity was open, but it was closing fast. Japan had to choose: strike south and wake the American giant, or strike north, stab the Soviets in the back, and potentially link up with Germany to rule the Eurasian landmass. The decision rested on a knife's edge, and in the Kremlin, one man was watching the movement of Japanese troops with a terror that kept him awake at night. That man was Joseph Stalin, but the eyes watching Tokyo belonged to Richard Sorge. Sorge was arguably the greatest spy in history, a German communist posing as a loyal Nazi journalist in Tokyo. He had infiltrated the highest levels of the German embassy. He drank with generals, charmed diplomats' wives, and gathered intelligence that would decide the fate of nations. Sorge knew exactly what was at stake. In Moscow, the situation was apocalyptic. The Germans were tearing through the Ukraine and Belarus. Stalin had a massive reserve of fresh, winter-hardened troops stationed in Siberia, the Siberian divisions, but he couldn't move them. He was terrified that the moment he pulled those troops west to fight Hitler, Japan would invoke Kantokun and invade the undefended Russian East. Stalin was paralyzed, caught in a vice between Hitler in the west and the Japanese Kwantung Army in the east. Everything depended on the decision in Tokyo. Throughout the summer of 1941, the pressure from Berlin was suffocating. The German ambassador, Eugen Ott, unaware that his close friend Sorge was a Soviet spy, showed him telegrams from Ribbentrop. They were begging Japan, attack Vladivostok, intercept American supplies heading to Russia, open a second front now. The Japanese army was ready. They had doubled the size of their forces in Manchuria. They were conducting massive military exercises on the border, explicitly designed to mask the buildup for an invasion. To the naked eye, war looked inevitable. The Strike North faction argued that if they didn't attack now while Russia was weak, they would never get another chance. They argued that the Soviet threat was permanent, while the American threat was distant. But there was a counter-argument, and it came down to a single, sticky substance: oil. The United States, watching Japan's aggression in China and Indochina, had tightened the economic noose. An oil embargo was looming. The Japanese Navy argued furiously that attacking Russia would yield no oil. Siberian tundra couldn't fuel battleships. Only the Dutch East Indies could do that. They argued that attacking Russia would bog Japan down in a land war of attrition while their fuel reserves dried up, leaving the fleet helpless against the Americans. Sorge watched this tug-of-war with desperate intensity. He sent frantic messages to Moscow, his radio operator tapping out codes in a hidden room in Tokyo. "Japanese mobilization proceeding," he messaged. "Decision not yet made." Stalin waited. The trains in Siberia sat idle, steam engines puffing in the cold air, loaded with soldiers who didn't know if they were heading west to die in the snows of Moscow or east to die on the plains of Manchuria. In our timeline, the coin flipped tails. The Navy won the argument. The oil embargo forced Japan's hand toward the resources of the South. In October 1941, Sorge sent his most famous message: Japan will not attack the Soviet Union unless the Red Army collapses completely. That message changed history. Stalin pulled the Siberian divisions. They rushed west, arriving just in time to stop the Germans at the gates of Moscow. Japan sailed for Pearl Harbor, awakening the American giant. But it was a near-run thing, a very near-run thing. The Kantokuin plan wasn't canceled, it was merely postponed. The army officers were furious. They believed they were missing their destiny. All it would have taken was a slight shift in the wind, a more persuasive argument from the army, a belief that the U.S. would stay neutral, or perhaps a delay in the American oil embargo just long enough to let the Northern strategy proceed. So, let us tilt the world. Let us change one conversation, one realization, one moment in the imperial court. The date is October 14th, 1941. The deciding conference begins. The coin is in the air. And this time, it flips heads.
The air in the room is heavy, thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of green tea. It is October 14, 1941. The location is the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. The men gathered here hold the fate of the Pacific in their hands. At the head of the table sits Army Minister Hideki Tojo. In our history, this is the day Tojo cemented the path to Pearl Harbor, driven by the desperation for oil. But in this timeline, the conversation shifts. As the Navy Minister lays out the plans for the Southern Strike, the seizure of the Philippines, the bombardment of Hawaii, Tojo stares at the map. He sees the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. He sees the industrial statistics of the United States: 10 times the steel, 10 times the oil, 10 times the ships. A cold realization grips him. He speaks, his voice cutting through the Navy's presentation like a razor. To strike America is suicide, Tojo says. We may win the first battle, but we will lose the war. We cannot defeat a continent. The room goes silent. This is heresy coming from the aggressive army minister. But Tojo points to the map of Russia. The German Wehrmacht is at the gates of Moscow. The Soviet Union is a rotting house waiting to be kicked in. If we strike north, we do not fight a giant, we kill a dying man. The Navy protests, but the oil, we have reserves for only 6 months. Tojo slams his fist on the table. Germany will share their oil once the Trans-Siberian Railway is ours. If we attack America, we fight alone. If we attack Russia, we fight with the Axis. We link the empires. We break the British blockade overland. The argument rages for hours, but the logic of survival over gamble takes root. The fear of the United States, the reluctance to wake the sleeping giant wins out. The emperor, silent until now, gives a slight nod. He prefers a localized war in Siberia to a global war against the Anglo-American alliance.
The die is cast. The order is written. It is not the order for the combined fleet to sail for Hawaii. It is the order for the Kwantung Army to cross the border. Codename, Kantokuen. Execution date, immediate. The timeline has snapped. In the secret room in Tokyo, Richard Sorge's radio operator receives the new transmission. He expects the signal indicating a southern advance, the signal that would save Moscow. Instead, his face drains of color. The code he deciphers is a nightmare. Imperial Army moving north. Large-scale offensive imminent. Target, Vladivostok and Lake Baikal. Sorge stares at the paper. He knows what this means. He frantically tries to send a warning to Moscow, but it is too late. The logic of the timeline has shifted against him. Thousands of miles away, on the foggy decks of the aircraft carriers Akagi and Kaga, the pilots are confused. The mission to bomb Pearl Harbor has been scrubbed. The fleet is ordered to stand down, to maintain a defensive perimeter. The Zero fighters are not loaded with torpedoes for battleships. They are stripped down, winterized, and crated for transport to airfields in Manchuria. On the Manchurian border, the silence of the steppe is broken by the roar of engines. 700,000 Japanese soldiers, the cream of the imperial army, begin to move. They are not looking at palm trees. They are looking at the frozen Amur River. The northern strategy has begun, and in Washington, D.C., the phone does not ring. There is no panic. There is no interception of a declaration of war. The American public continues their day, reading newspapers about the war in Europe, thankful that the Pacific remains peaceful. They have no idea that the safety they feel is the seal on the Soviet Union's death warrant.
November 15th, 1941. The Soviet Far East. The attack does not begin with the scream of dive bombers over a tropical harbor. It begins with the thunder of artillery over the Ussuri River. At dawn, under the cover of a blinding snowstorm, 20 divisions of the Kwantung Army surge across the border. The Soviet defenders are caught completely off guard. They had been watching the news from the west, their eyes fixed on the German advance toward Moscow. They assumed the Japanese were posturing. They were wrong. Japanese infantry, hardened by years of fighting in China, utilize the harsh winter terrain to their advantage. They don't fight like the Germans with massive armored spearheads. They fight like water, infiltrating Soviet lines, cutting communications, and bypassing strongpoints. In the sky, the Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, painted in winter camouflage, sweep the skies clear of the obsolete Soviet I-16 fighters. But the primary target isn't a city, it's a railroad. The Trans-Siberian Railway is the carotid artery of the Soviet Union. It is the only lifeline connecting the resource-rich East to the dying West. It is the only way to move the Siberian divisions to Moscow, and it is the only way American Lend-Lease supplies landing in Vladivostok can reach the front lines against Hitler. On November 20th, a specialized Japanese strike force using armored trains and airborne troops seizes the railway junction at Chita near Lake Baikal. They blow the bridges, they tear up miles of track. The artery is severed. In the Kremlin, the mood shifts from desperation to absolute horror. General Zhukov bursts into Stalin's office, his face pale. He reports that telegraph lines to the east are dead. He reports that the first trains carrying the Siberian reinforcements, the men destined to save Moscow, have been stopped cold in the middle of the tundra, thousands of miles from the German front. They are not disembarking to fight the Wehrmacht. They are disembarking into a frozen ambush, surrounded by the Japanese army.
Stalin stands paralyzed. For the first time in the war, the man of steel is truly broken. He knows the math. He knows that without those 40 divisions, the defense of Moscow is mathematically impossible. He looks at the map on the wall. The red markers of the Soviet Union are being squeezed from both sides. A giant vice is closing on the Eurasian continent. The ultimate nightmare of a two-front war has arrived. Meanwhile, in Vladivostok, the sky turns black. The Japanese Navy, having no American fleet to fight, turns its fury on the Russian port. Battleships meant for the Solomon Islands are now shelling Soviet positions. The city, a vital hub for American supplies, is flattened. The warehouses full of trucks, fuel, and food meant for the Red Army are burning. And what of the Americans? In Washington, President Roosevelt reads the intelligence reports with a sinking heart. He sees the Japanese invasion for what it is, a death blow to Russia. But he is handcuffed. Japan has not attacked American soil.
They have not sunk American ships. They have attacked a communist dictatorship that many Americans distrust. The isolationist America First movement argues loudly that this is a war between tyrants, fascists versus communists, and that America should let them destroy each other. There is no political will for war. The day of infamy never happens. The galvanizing moment that united the American people vanishes. Roosevelt can only watch as the Japanese seal off the Russian Pacific coast, ensuring that no aid can reach the dying Soviet state. The quarantine is complete. The bear is trapped in the cage, and the hunters are closing in for the kill.
December 5th, 1941. The day history holds its breath. In our timeline, this is the day the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive to save Moscow. It was one of the greatest military turnarounds in history, fueled by 40 fresh Siberian divisions, men in white camouflage who skied out of the forests and hammered the exhausted Germans. But in this timeline, the forests are empty. On the outskirts of Moscow, German General Heinz Guderian looks through his binoculars. The temperature is 30 below zero. His tanks are frozen, his men are suffering from frostbite, and his supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. He knows he is one counterattack away from disaster. He waits for the Soviet hammer to fall. He waits and waits, but there is only silence. The Soviet front lines are manned by terrified militia, factory workers, and the remnants of shattered units. They have no heavy tanks. They have no fresh reserves. The T-34s that should be rolling west are burning on flat cars in Siberia, destroyed by Japanese aircraft. Guderian realizes the truth. The enemy has nothing left. He gives the order, Vorwärts. The final German push, Operation Typhoon, does not stall. It grinds forward. The Wehrmacht, sensing blood, summons one last reserve of adrenaline. They punch through the flimsy defensive lines at Kempthy. By December 8th, German reconnaissance units spot the onion domes of St. Basil's Cathedral. Inside the Kremlin, the panic is absolute. The sky is choked with smoke as NKVD officers burn millions of documents in the courtyards. The realization has set in. The capital is lost. Stalin is faced with the choice that haunted him in reality, but this time the equation is hopeless. He orders the evacuation of the government to Kuyashev, deeper in the east. But even as the armored train pulls out of the station, the news arrives that Japanese bombers are ranging as far west as the Urals. There is nowhere safe to run.
As Stalin leaves, the morale of the Red Army collapses. The rumor spreads like wildfire. The Japanese are behind us. The Germans are in front of us. Stalin has fled. The disciplined defense turns into a rout. On December 20th, 1941, the unthinkable happens. German infantry from the 2nd Panzer Division storm the Kremlin walls. The fighting is brutal, room to room, bayonet to bayonet in the gilded halls of the Tsars. But without the Siberian reserves to plug the gaps, the defenders are overwhelmed. That evening, a swastika flag is raised over the Red Square. The image is captured on film by a German propaganda crew. Grainy, black and white footage that will be beamed across the world. It shows German soldiers warming their hands over a fire built from Soviet furniture, with the Kremlin burning in the background. The Third Rome has fallen. Thousands of miles away, in a damp prison cell in Sugamo Prison, Tokyo, Richard Sorge sits on a wooden cot. He has been arrested by the Kempe Tai, the Japanese secret police. In our timeline, he went to his execution knowing that his work had saved Moscow. He died a secret hero. But in this timeline, his interrogator walks in with a smirk and tosses a newspaper onto the floor. It is a special edition of the Asahi Shimbun. The headline screams in bold kanji, "Moscow falls! German allies victorious!" Sorge stares at the paper. His hands tremble. He reads the reports of the Japanese link-up with German advance units near Omsk. He reads about the collapse of the Soviet state. The immense weight of failure crushes him. He realizes that his warning was not enough. He didn't just lose his life, he lost the war. He sits in the darkness, not weeping for himself, but for the world that is about to be born.
April 1942. The spring thaw brings mud to the Russian steppe, but it also brings a new reality. Near the city of Omsk, deep in central Russia, a Japanese scout on a motorcycle crests a hill. He looks through his binoculars and sees a convoy of trucks approaching from the west. They are not Soviet trucks. They are painted gray, bearing the Iron Cross. The motorcycle descends. The convoy stops. A German officer steps out, lighting a cigarette. The Japanese soldier bows. The German salutes. A photographer snaps a picture. This image, the handshake at Omsk, becomes the defining image of the 20th century in this timeline. It symbolizes the death of the Allied cause. The Axis powers have successfully linked up across the Eurasian landmass. The British blockade, which was slowly strangling Germany, is now useless. Resources begin to flow. Rubber and tin from Japanese-occupied Asia flow west to German factories. German precision machinery and synthetic oil technology flow east to Tokyo. The world island is united. In London, Winston Churchill stares at this photograph in the morning papers. The cigar falls from his mouth. He is a man of indomitable spirit, but he is also a realist. Without the Soviet Union absorbing the bulk of the Wehrmacht, there was no hope for a second front. The millions of German soldiers who would have died in Stalingrad and Kursk are now free. They are turning their eyes toward the English Channel. Britain is now an island under siege, not just by Germany, but by a continent. And across the Atlantic? The mood in the United States has curdled from isolationism into paranoia. The fall of Russia and the handshake at Omsk vindicates the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh argues that intervening now would be suicide. Europe is lost, he declares to a packed stadium in New York. Asia is lost. We must build Fortress America.
President Roosevelt is politically destroyed. The 1942 midterms are a bloodbath for his party. The American public, seeing no direct attack on their soil, refuses to send their sons to die in a war that is already lost. The United States begins a massive naval buildup, not to liberate Europe, but to patrol the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, terrified of the day the Axis turns its gaze toward the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union dissolves into chaos. Joseph Stalin does not survive the collapse. As his train attempts to reach the Urals, it is stopped by a renegade unit of the NKVD, furious at his leadership. There is no trial, just a burst of machine gun fire in a snowy clearing. With the dictator dead, the USSR fractures into warlord states. In the forests of Siberia, remnants of the Red Army fight a desperate guerrilla war against the Japanese. In the West, puppet governments rise up under German supervision. The dream of international communism is buried in the mass graves of the Eastern Front. The war, for all intents and purposes, is over. The hot war has cooled into a terrifying asymmetric standoff. The old world belongs to the Axis. The new world stands alone, shivering behind its ocean walls. We fade from the chaos of war to the eerie calm of a new order. The year is 1950. The screen shows a world map hanging in a schoolroom in Berlin.
A child's pointer traces the new borders of the Reich. The colors have changed. The red of the Soviet Union is gone, replaced by a jagged scar running down the spine of the Ural Mountains. To the west of the mountains lies Reichskommissariat Moskowien, a German vassal state that stretches from France to the Urals. To the east lies the Far Eastern Resource Zone, a Japanese protectorate encompassing Siberia, China, and Southeast Asia.
The Peace of Omsk, signed in 1943, has formalized the division of the world. The Axis powers have not just won battles, they have rewritten geography. In Europe, the silence is deafening. There was no D-Day. There was no liberation of the camps. The Holocaust was completed in the shadows, a bureaucratic secret buried under the concrete of the new order. Berlin has been rebuilt into Germania, the capital of the world, adorned with monumental architecture designed by Albert Speer to dwarf the human spirit. The Wehrmacht has largely demobilized, replaced by a terrifyingly efficient police state. The resistance movements in France and Poland have been starved out, deprived of hope and external support. In Asia, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is no longer a slogan, it is an economic reality. Japanese super battleships, the largest ever built, patrol the Indian Ocean, securing the sea lanes that pump oil from the Dutch East Indies to the factories of Osaka and the naval yards of Hamburg. The Trans-Siberian Railway, now the Axis Friendship Line, is the busiest trade route on Earth, carrying German precision optics east and Asian rubber west. And what if the United Kingdom? Britain stands as a tragic monument to stubbornness. It was never invaded. The Royal Navy and the RAF made a cross-channel invasion too costly for Hitler, who was content to let the island rot. But it is a neutralized state. Starved by a continental blockade and cut off from its empire in the east, Britain has been forced into a humiliating armistice. Winston Churchill has been ousted, replaced by a government willing to coexist with the Nazi hegemon across the Channel. The Union Jack still flies over London, but the city is gray, hungry, and irrelevant. The sun has finally set on the British Empire. The world has become a binary system. Two massive totalitarian gravity wells, Berlin and Tokyo, control the world island. And on the other side of the oceans, watching with a mixture of fear and fanaticism, is the last remaining democracy.
In the United States, the 1950s are not the era of rock and roll, suburban sprawl, and brightly colored convertibles. They are an era of gray concrete, civil defense drills, and suffocating paranoia. New York City looks different. The skyline is dominated not just by the Empire State Building, but by massive flak towers positioned along the Hudson River. At night, searchlights sweep the clouds, hunting for the high-altitude contrails of the America bomber, the Messerschmitt Me-264. These German aircraft, operating from bases in the Azores and occupied Iceland, fly with impunity at 40,000 feet, conducting reconnaissance, reminding the Americans that they are never truly safe. The culture of the United States has mutated under the pressure. The Great Fear has replaced the American dream. The government, terrified of Axis infiltration, has empowered the FBI with totalitarian authority. There is no counterculture. There is no dissent. To question the military budget is to be labeled a saboteur. The country has become a mirror image of the monsters it refused to fight. A fortress America, where freedom is sacrificed on the altar of survival. Technology has taken a darker path. In our timeline, the 1950s were the dawn of the jet age for travel.
In this timeline, the skies are empty of civilian traffic. The air belongs to the United States Air Force's jet interceptors, desperate copies of German designs patrolling the Atlantic Wall. And then there is the ultimate weapon. The Manhattan Project, delayed by a lack of urgency in the early 40s, eventually succeeds in 1946, but it is too late to win a war. It is only enough to prevent an invasion. The United States detonates its first atomic bomb in the Nevada desert, signaling to the world that it still has teeth. But the Axis is not far behind. Weeks later, a seismograph in Alaska detects a massive tremor. The epicenter is the Ural Mountains. Germany has the bomb. Japan is close.
The world settles into a cold war far colder than the one we knew. It is not a standoff between two superpowers vying for influence in the Third World. It is a standoff between one isolated continent and the rest of the planet. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, once highways of commerce, are now no man's lands, mined and patrolled by nuclear submarines. In the White House, a gray-haired, exhausted president, perhaps a survivor like Eisenhower or a hardliner like MacArthur, looks at the map. He sees the red ink of the Axis covering Europe, Africa, and Asia. He knows that the economic noose is tightening. The United States is rich in resources, but it is cut off from world markets. It is a besieged castle, slowly running out of time. The tragedy of this world is not just the tyranny that rules the East, but the fear that rules the West. The land of the free has become a garrison state, forever waiting for the radar blip that signals the end of the world. The war never truly ended, it just froze into a perpetual, anxiety-ridden Tuesday where the sun never fully rises.
And so we leave this frozen timeline. A timeline where the world is darker, quieter, and divided by a wall of fear far higher than the one in Berlin. It is terrifying to realize how fragile our own history is. The safety of the modern world didn't rest on the atomic bomb or the D-Day landings. It rested on a single strategic debate in Tokyo in 1941. It rested on the decision to chase the oil of the South instead of the ideology of the North. Richard Sorge, the man who saved the world in our timeline, died thinking he had failed in this one. But his story reminds us that history is not a river that flows in one direction. It is a series of forks in the road. In the end, the Northern strategy proves one chilling fact. The Axis powers had the capacity to win. They just had to trust each other enough to strike the same enemy at the same time. So, I turn the question to you. If the United States had remained neutral in 1941, could they have survived as a lone democracy in a fascist world? Or was their downfall inevitable the moment Moscow fell? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the ice-blue alternate history of World War II, make sure to like and subscribe. We have many more timelines to explore. Until then, keep looking at the maps, and remember, the past is never as settled as it seems.